Coming up on New Day at Arirang, it's Election Day in South Korea. In around 12 hours from now, people in South Korea should have an idea of who their next president will be come May. Polling stations opened a couple of hours ago and will stay open until 6 p.m. for people without COVID-19. People with the virus permitted to vote until 7:30 at designated areas. South Korea on course to see a record daily number of new COVID-19 cases on Wednesday as Omicron whips through the population. Health officials projecting over 325,000 new cases, well over 100,000 more than the previous day. Plus, the United States and the UK are banning Russian oil imports over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. The US going one step further than Britain, blocking imports of all gas and energy from Russia, a decision President Biden says targets the main artery of Russia's economy.
Hello and welcome to this Wednesday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. March 9th here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Mo-gan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Over the next hour, we'll take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world. However, we start with our coverage of South Korea's presidential election as tens of millions of Koreans head to the polls to pick their next leader.
Voting for the 20th presidential election is underway, and voters in South Korea began casting their ballots from 6 a.m. and have until this evening to decide how the country will be run over the next 5 years.
For more on this, we have two of our reporters at a couple of different polling stations here in Seoul. First, we turn to our Kim Yeon-sung, who's been out at a polling station in the capital central Jongno-gu district. That's a highly symbolic area in Korean politics stretching back decades. Yeon-sung, you've been there since the wee hours for us. Are you seeing many voters yet?
Right, so Mark, like you've already mentioned, voting kicked off at 6 a.m. this morning. And since the moment the polling station opens its doors, people have been waiting in long lines outside the station, out in the cold and out in the dark. Now, within the first hour, more than 945,000 or 2.1% of voters have voted. With voter turnout already having reached a record high of 37% during early voting last weekend, today is looking like it's going to be equally as busy. On Wednesday, 14,464 polling stations nationwide are open to accommodate a total of more than 44 million voters. Voting will run for more than 12 hours from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. for regular voters and 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. for COVID-19 infected or isolating voters. For those who have not yet cast a ballot, there are several things to take note of before heading to polling stations. Having ID is essential. Voters must bring a driver's license, passport, or ID card to cast a ballot. And also, taking selfies or pictures of the ballots while inside the polling booths is strictly prohibited. These acts are a violation of the election law, and offenders can be sentenced to up to 2 years in prison or fined up to 4 million Korean won, or roughly $3,200. But taking a picture outside polling stations and posting it on social media is allowed. So make sure when you get here, you follow through the election laws and guidelines to make sure that your vote counts. Back to you, Mo-gan and Mark.
Well, thank you very much for that, Yeon-sung. Yeah, you do see a lot of social media posts of people outside the polling stations in South Korea. I suppose it happens in many countries as well, though. But this is the first presidential election in South Korea since the COVID-19 pandemic struck and caused so much chaos, and the first major election to allow people infected or isolated to vote both on the same date and at the same place. During last year's by-elections and the 2020 general elections, of course, also held during the pandemic. At that time, patients were only allowed to participate in early voting or to vote from their residence.
For more on this, we also connect to our Han Sung-woo, who's standing by at another polling station at Seoul's Yangcheon-gu district. Sung-woo, how is it looking there?
Hi, Mo-gyun. Well, I can say it's very busy. It's not so busy yet here, despite the total voter turnout rate projected to be quite high this election, thanks to the early votes that concluded on Saturday. I'm standing here at the Mokdong Youth Center in southwest Seoul, one of close to 14,500 polling stations nationwide, where locals have started to cast their votes starting from 6 in the morning. I've been here since then, and as a citizen, what a sight it is to see people exercising their fundamental right. I had the chance to ask some voters how they felt after submitting their ballots, and here's what one had to say.
As a Korean citizen, it's an honor for me to be exercising my right to vote on Election Day. I'm hoping the country prospers under the leadership of its new president.
As for the virus infected and those under isolation, they'll be able to cast their ballots tonight after regular voting ends at 6 until 7:30 p.m. Health authorities reported that as of Tuesday, there are around 1.16 million people undergoing at-home treatment, of which close to 900,000 are of legal age to vote. They'll be allowed temporary leave starting from 5:50 that is, before heading to the polls, where officials will check official text messages they should have received from health authorities, along with, of course, their IDs. And this time, unlike during the early vote, which sparked a huge controversy, the virus-infected and people under isolation will be able to place their votes inside the ballot boxes themselves. Just like all the other voters, instead of handing them to poll station officials. That's all I have for this newscast, but I'll be back with more updates in our next one.
Songy, thank you very much for that report. We'll be connecting to both our reporters there throughout the rest of what will be a very busy day, of course. Now, on the eve of Election Day, rival party candidates continued their campaign rallies on Tuesday night. The ruling Democratic Party of Korea's candidate Lee Jae-myung was in Seoul's Cheonggye Square, the scene of the world-famous candlelight protest 5 years ago.
Wrapping up his campaign before the legally mandated midnight deadline, Lee met with young voters in the university area in Hongdae. Kim Do-yeon reports.
On the eve of the presidential election 2022, the ruling Democratic Party of Korea's candidate Lee Jae-myung took the podium at Cheonggye Square in central Seoul for his final rally of this campaign.
I believe in the greatness of our citizens. I believe in the high awareness and collective intelligence of our citizens. With a great people, I want to make this country a great place to show to the world.
This is the place where 5 years ago, millions of citizens came out to hold candlelight protests to call for the resignation of then-President Park Geun-hye. Lee Jae-myung says what happened here 5 years ago restored democracy in South Korea, and that it was then when the citizens gave him a national spotlight as a politician, leading to where he is now. After the rally, his very last event before the legal cutoff point for campaign activities, he was walking the streets and meeting young voters in the university area of Hongdae. All in all, according to the party, he's held 80 rallies over the past 22 days and in total given nearly 42 hours of speeches. More than half of those were in the capital region, as many voters there remain undecided. And as he said in a press briefing on Tuesday morning, each vote may play a crucial role.
Dear citizens, it's a tight and desperate election until the end. Many are doing all they can right now. Thank you very much. I will repay all of you with a victory.
His messages during this election have been centered on himself and his capacity as a politician, which he says is proven through his past accomplishments as a mayor and a governor. He called himself the president of economy, saying that he's the candidate with the ability to revive the country's economy, which right now, like everywhere else in the world, has been hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. He put forth something called the 555 Pledge: be one of the 5 biggest economies in the world, break the 5,000 points mark in the markets, and surpass $50,000 for GDP. But all this, he says, is only possible with the right president. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
And the presidential candidate for the main opposition People Power Party, Yoon Suk-yeol, held his final campaign rally in front of Seoul City Hall Tuesday evening.
That being said, he continued his campaign right until the legal cutoff at midnight, wrapping up the night in Seoul's southern Gangnam-gu district. Our Lee Kyung-eun, who has been following Yoon on this campaign, files this report.
Despite losing his voice from more than 100 speeches he's given over the past few weeks, Yoon Suk-yeol of the main opposition People Power Party on Tuesday evening picked up the microphone one last time as he concluded his campaign to become South Korea's next president. He stood before citizens in Seoul, where he personally chose to wrap up his 22 days on the road, appealing to voters nationwide.
This marathon is nearing an end. I urge you to show your encouragement and overwhelming support so I can be first over the finish line.
The big finale was held in Seoul Plaza right in front of Seoul City Hall. The site, located in the Gwanghwamun area, was just several hundred meters away from where his main rival Lee Jae-myung gave his finale speech.
This is also the same neighborhood where Yoon kicked off his campaign, and Yoon is making one last call for a change of government to achieve the key values he's been promoting throughout his campaign: fairness and common sense.
Giving the call an extra boost were four of Yoon's companions who joined him for his finale. An Chol-soo, who relinquished his candidacy for the minor opposition People's Party to back Yoon, was there for his third joint campaign rally following their last-minute merger and after multiple rounds of holding his own rallies for Yoon. Also on site were two former rivals from the party's primary and the party's chairman Lee Jun-suk, highlighting the team spirit. Prior to finale, Yoon hit some of the places he visited on day one of his campaign, echoing the message he proclaimed on his first day, that he's the president the people are calling for.
It's the people that called on me and gave me the chance to run. I don't owe anything to any political force. The only thing I owe is a promise to the people.
Yoon ended the day and his campaign in Gangnam-gu district, a popular hangout for young people. Yoon traveled a record 10,000 kilometers plus during the campaign, an effort which his camp says will be reflected in the election outcome. Lee Kyung-eun, Arirang News.
Moving on from the election now and turning to the COVID-19 situation in South Korea, the country set for yet another record number of daily infections when the official numbers come out in just over an hour from now, with cases way over 320,000 even as of late last night.
In a move to better manage the surging number of patients, authorities have decided to allow more medical facilities to prescribe oral treatments. For more on this, our reporter Choi Min-jung is here in the studio with us. Good morning, Min-jung.
Good morning.
So like always, let's start with the local infections.
Well, Mo-kyun, we're forecast to see yet another record-breaking figure of COVID-19 cases today, as figures from midnight to 9 p.m. Tuesday have already surpassed 300,000. Over that period, South Korea saw over 326,000 cases, a huge jump of almost 130,000 cases from the day before. So we're expecting today's tally to potentially reach a whopping 350,000. Including the latest figures, the country's total caseload has surpassed 5.1 million, meaning 1 in 10 people in South Korea has had COVID-19. The country passed the 4 million mark just last weekend, and it only took 4 days for the 5 million mark to be hit.
Yeah, I remember when Omicron first arrived in South Korea, it didn't seem like we had many cases at all at the outset, but how quickly that changed to the situation we're in now. In a bid to handle this spike, we hear that the antiviral drug developed by Pfizer is going to be made available at more areas of distribution.
That's right, Mark. Starting today, general hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, and rehabilitation medical centers can prescribe Pfizer's Paxlovid to COVID-19 patients as well. Up until now, oral pills could only be prescribed by medical institutions, local clinics, and hospitals that were designated to treat COVID-19 patients recovering from home. And also today, another 45,000 courses of Paxlovid will arrive in the country, which means the country has so far received 163,000 courses. The treatment was first introduced in mid-January and has been administered to more than 25,000 people as of last Friday, mostly to people recovering at home.
But Min-jung, we hear that PCR testing requirements for inbound travelers will also change beginning Thursday. Right, Mogyan. Authorities have decided to reduce the number of mandatory PCR tests as demand for tests soared due to the rapid spread of the virus. To increase efficiency, inbound travelers will no longer have to get 2 PCR tests on the day of arrival and the 7th day after arriving. And from tomorrow, PCR tests will only be required in the first day of arrival, and on the 7th day, people will be asked to take the rapid antigen test instead. Measures have also been eased for people working at nursing facilities. Those who have gotten their fourth shots will no longer have to take regular PCR tests twice a week. Well, that's going to make it more convenient for them. Well, thank you, Min-jung, as always, for your report. Thank you.
Now, in its latest move to punish Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, the US is cutting off Russia from importing its oil to the United States. President Biden said the move targets the main artery of Russia's economy.
But it's also going to have a domestic impact, with Biden admitting Americans will have to pay even higher prices at the pump. Kim Hyo-sun tells us more.
President Biden announced Tuesday that the U.S. is banning imports of Russian oil, natural gas, and coal in response to Moscow's invasion of Ukraine.
We're banning all imports of Russian oil and gas and energy. That means Russian oil will no longer be acceptable at U.S. ports, and the American people will deal another powerful blow to Putin's war machine.
Sanctions on Russia's oil and gas industry had mostly been viewed as off the table, as American and European officials feared a global price spike. However, there is increasing pressure on the Biden administration, including from Ukraine's president and U.S. lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. However, addressing the nation, President Biden acknowledged the move will lead to higher fuel costs for regular Americans.
I'm going to do everything I can to minimize Putin's price hike here at home. In coordination with our partners, we've already announced that we're releasing 60 million barrels of oil from our joint oil reserves. Half of that, 30 million, is coming from the United States.
He said he would do what he can to minimize the impact of the import ban. The decision shuts off the relatively small flow of Russian energy into the U.S., which accounted for less than 10% of its energy portfolio as of 2021, of which only about 3% was crude oil. Soon after Biden's announcement, the U.K. said it will phase out Russian oil imports by the end of 2022. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now, even while the Russian military slams cities across Ukraine with shells. The two sides recently announced a ceasefire to allow civilians to flee some areas. Whether they've been holding or not is debatable at this point. There were supposed to be lawyers representing Ukraine and Russia going toe-to-toe to go through the legal arguments in regards to this at the UN's top court, the International Court of Justice, in a legal bid to perhaps bring an end to this conflict. Speaking in The Hague on Monday, the permanent representative of the president of Ukraine in Crimea condemned Russia for disrespecting international law. However, the Russians just flat out refused to show up.
Russian forces launched military operations in Ukraine on February 24th, just a matter of days after Moscow recognized Ukraine's breakaway regions Donetsk and Luhansk as independent republics. President Putin also said the, quote, special military operation was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. For more, we're joined by Natasha Kurt, lecturer in international peace and security in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Good morning.
Good morning or good evening. Yeah. Hi.
Well, firstly, we'd like to know if the International Justice Court has the ability to bring the end to the war, and what powers does the court have to penalize Moscow for its actions in Ukraine?
Okay, the International Court of Justice is part of the UN system, but it doesn't have any kind of enforcement powers. All it can do is to indicate provisional measures, and the state parties can then, should then ideally comply with those measures. But unfortunately, the court doesn't really have any power as such.
Right, it seems highly unlikely that Putin is going to pay any attention to what the International Court of Justice has to say when it comes out with its ruling in the coming days. What kind of legal arguments, though, did Ukraine bring to the table? And I probably know the answer to this, but were you surprised that the Russians didn't bother showing up?
I'm not surprised that the Russians didn't bother showing up, because there wouldn't be too much that they could say. Russia, as you know, is suggesting that Ukraine is committing genocide against Russians within Ukraine. So what Ukraine is doing is something slightly different. People are comparing it to the case of Bosnia and Croatia, when they sued Serbia in the ICJ. So basic in the 1990s. So what Ukraine is trying to say is they're not trying to say Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine, but what they're trying to say is that basically Russia is manipulating the idea of genocide in order to justify aggression. So it's kind of quite a creative way of looking at things.
Well, Natasha, Western powers have been imposing crushing sanctions on Russia, but insist they aren't going to intervene beyond that. Can you see any scenario under which the West would engage directly in military confrontation with Russia? And hypothetically, if that were to happen, what would likely happen?
I think it's very difficult to see the West actually engaging in direct military action with Russia. And I think they've kind of made it very clear that they really completely, want to avoid that, not least because I think it would be very difficult to justify that to their populations, to their respective constituencies, in particular because obviously Russia is a nuclear power. So this is very different to if you compare it to, say, I don't know, Bosnia, in the 1990s when there was also a lot of debate about whether we should or shouldn't have a no-fly zone and so on. And eventually, we did have a no-fly zone and NATO intervened. But in that case, obviously, Milosevic didn't have nuclear weapons. So I find it very difficult to see that there would be or could be a direct military confrontation with Russia. I mean, obviously, if Russia, for example, launched an attack on the Baltic states, then one might perhaps envisage something like that. But I think really, that's not what people want.
Well, hopefully these economic sanctions will have some effect on Russia. Everyone thinks of Russia as this giant nation, which it is geographically speaking, but its economy is pretty much like that of Italy's, aka just a middle-sized economy. So the sanctions hopefully might have some effect on Putin's decision-making. However, the Russian leader continues to insist, like we talked about, that this war is aimed at demilitarizing and getting rid of these unnamed Nazis within Ukraine. In your eyes, do you think anything Putin is trying to say to justify this conflict holds any water? And if you do, which I expect you do, consider it to be somewhat of a smokescreen, what do you think are the real reasons behind why Putin decided to invade Ukraine?
I mean, the whole idea of denazification, I mean, you have to look back to the Second World War and, you know, this happened in the Baltic states as well, where essentially during the Second World War, you did have those who collaborated with the Nazis because they saw Nazism as a lesser evil than communism. And you had the same scenario actually in former Yugoslavia with Croatians who collaborated with the Nazis. And then that, you know, history was brought back by the Serbs in their fight against the Croats. And that's kind of a similar idea now that, you know, Putin is able to kind of mobilize that narrative because there are still people alive who remember that. And the Second World War has become a kind of, you know, the kind of overarching narrative, really, for Russia, the kind of, you know, myth of the Russian nation, you know, Russia victorious and so on, Russia fighting the Nazis, you know, so, you know, I'm not saying, you know, that this is a kind of true narrative as such, but, you know, there will be Russians within Russia who remember, you know, this historical fact. And so, you know, with all of this kind of information warfare, there is usually always a kind of grain of truth, if you like, but obviously it's kind of magnified beyond, you know, in a kind of absurd manner, you know, because the idea, of course, that Zelensky could be a Nazi is absurd, you know, considering that he is Jewish and so on. So I think that whole narrative also is perhaps breaking down a little bit. It's difficult to tell what Russians within Russia actually think about it because obviously, you know, they're kind of consuming quite often Russian news from Russian TV and so on. But, you know, one of Putin's main advisors, Dmitry Peskov, for example, he seems to have dropped that whole idea of denazification. So it may be that, you know, eventually they're going to realize that that narrative perhaps is not really as powerful as they thought it was. So yes, I mean, obviously it's a smokescreen. I'm not sure if that's quite the right word, but you know, what are the real reasons? Well, you know, those reasons are probably to some extent only knowable to Putin, but you know, there are a number of reasons that you could impute, you know, to Putin's invasion, which has taken everyone by surprise. Because, you know, I think people thought it would be confined to the eastern part of Ukraine. You know, but there are certainly military objectives that Russia would like to achieve. And for example, the southern port of Kherson, you know, which supplies water to Crimea, that's very important. Also, the town of Mykolaiv, Soviet shipbuilding facility. You know, the Russian Navy needs to build up its capabilities. So there's a lot of infrastructure that I think would be very useful to Russia, apart from the fact that Putin is clearly also quite obsessed, you know, with somehow destroying Ukraine or partially destroying it or disabling it, in the sense that, you know, Russia doesn't like the idea of a kind of democratic, you know, kind of liberal democratic country right next door. Because it kind of shines a spotlight on, you know, Russia's political system, which is very different.
Mm-hmm. All right, Natasha, thank you so much for your insights. We assume it's late over there. Thank you so much for staying up late for us. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
A North Korean patrol boat crossed on Tuesday into South Korean waters, albeit only briefly. It retreated after the country's Navy, South Korean Navy, fired warning shots. The vessel crossed the maritime border as it was chasing another North Korean boat that had crossed the northern limit line first. Bae-eun-ji with the details.
At about 9:30 a.m. on Tuesday, a North Korean boat crossed the northern limit line, a maritime boundary that separates the two Koreas. It crossed the border in waters about 10 kilometers east of South Korea's Paekryong Island. 15 minutes later, a North Korean patrol vessel that was chasing that boat also came into South Korean waters. Seoul's Joint Chiefs of Staff told reporters Tuesday that the South Korean Navy fired warning shots from a 40mm naval gun. It also sent warning messages 4 times before the patrol boat retreated back to the north 7 minutes after it entered South Korean waters. This is the first time that a North Korean patrol boat has crossed the maritime border since 2018. As for the other boat that crossed the border first, the South Korean military towed the ship near Paekryong Island to conduct further investigations. There were 7 people on board, all of them unarmed, and 6 of them wearing military uniforms. Although it's unclear why they crossed the northern limit line, those on board reportedly said that they accidentally veered into South Korean waters and have no intention of defecting to the south. Seoul's military also said that it is closely monitoring the situation in North Korea to be ready for any changes to the situation. 배은지, Arirang News.
Wildfires have been burning across South Korea's eastern coastal regions for 5 straight days now. Successful containment has been reported in some areas, but fires are still spreading elsewhere. Lee Si-hoo with this report.
On Tuesday, thousands of firefighters and troops succeeded in extinguishing major fires in the cities of Gangneung, Donghae, and Yeongwon-gun County. In the city of Samcheok, 80% of fires have been put out. But as wind speed is expected to be fast at 10 meters per second Wednesday morning, efforts will be taken to put out the last bit of the fire and prevent reignition. As for Uljin-gun County, 65% of fires were put out on Tuesday as 82 helicopters and 4,400 firefighters and troops were deployed. But the wind carried the fire to even more areas during the afternoon on Tuesday. One of those areas was the Kumgangsong Forest Reserve, home to more than 80,000 pine trees. The total damaged area from the fire now amounts to 22,000 hectares, up around 6,000 hectares from Sunday. This is more than around 1/3 of the area of Seoul. While there have been no casualties so far, thousands had to flee their homes and around 400 people are currently staying in temporary shelters. About 570 homes and storage facilities have been damaged as well, leaving many devastated.
I gave my best to build this farm, investing 150 million Korean won. But the amount of support from the government will be very limited.
There are also concerns of COVID-19 potentially spreading in the temporary shelter as people are staying in close proximity with one another. Meanwhile, the government has taken further steps to provide aid to the region. President Moon designated 2 more cities, Gangneung and Donghae, as special disaster zones on Tuesday. The administration had already designated the Uljin and Samcheok regions as special disaster zones on Sunday. The residents of the selected regions will be able to get some financial support, such as recovery costs and tax deferrals. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
And now we cross over to our Oh Soo-young for a global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Morgan. It is indeed time for Global Insight. The United Kingdom, parts of the United States and countries in Europe have been scrapping their vaccine passports and much of their social distancing rules as their vaccination rates are high and hospitalization rates have been falling. This has led to the question of whether the pandemic is nearing its end and transitioning towards becoming an endemic. Now, there are, of course, other parts of the world where the vaccine needs have not been met due to vaccine inequity. In the 3rd year of the global pandemic, we discuss how the world is dealing with COVID-19, and for this, I'm joined by Bharat Pankania, Senior Clinical Lecturer at the University of Exeter's College of Medicine and Health. A very warm welcome back, Dr. Pankania. It's lovely to see you. And, well, there's quite a lot of talk of an endemic these days, the pandemic transitioning to an endemic. So firstly, how do we define the term endemic and what makes it different from a pandemic?
So a pandemic refers to an infection that affects all people. Pandemos, affects all people. endemic means it is there all the time. And in a situation whereby you either have a lot of people who are periodically infected and therefore infectious, it makes a disease circulate within a community, within a global community, and it's persistently there. That means it's endemic. So for example, measles is endemic. We've always got measles. We are under control with measles because we immunize.
Well, what are the criterion that epidemiologists like yourself go by when determining whether or not a virus is at the endemic stage?
So when it moves from causing disease extensively in the world population and it stops infecting people because people are either immune because they've got the vaccine or they've had the infection and they are protected from further infections, but it then moves from that stage of having extensive number of cases, which is epidemic, to endemic, which means it is now in low level, but background cases still remain there. So it is at a lower level and you will get periodic outbreaks, but it is not there at a high level, which happens during the pandemic stage.
And of course, in the UK, where you are, all the restrictions are gone now. And well, then how are you expecting the pattern of transmissions to look for COVID-19?
So if we wish to know what will happen in the UK, a good example would be Denmark, which a few weeks before the UK released all its restrictions as well. And the case numbers shot up in Denmark. And similarly, whilst we're entering spring and longer days, I expect also our case numbers to shoot up. And already we are noticing that our hospital admissions in March are greater than they were in January. So this pandemic is not over. Whilst we have removed restrictions because fewer people are dying, it doesn't mean the virus has gone away.
Well, most people seem to be taking comfort in the fact that Omicron is proving to be slightly milder than previous variants. And well, do you think that Omicron is going to be the last COVID-19 variant, or is it possible that another significant variant could emerge?
So first things first, Omicron is not mild. The only reason why Omicron is mild is because the population has been extensively immunized and protected, and an Omicron infection in that group of people is not so severe. If you are not immunized at all, you can be severely ill even with Omicron. Furthermore, in answer to your question, is Omicron the last variant? Not at all. We can get a variant that is worse than Omicron, worse than Delta. On the other hand, we may get a variant which is mild disease causing. What we just don't know. Is it the end of variants? Definitely not.
And then, well, how long then we continue these protective measures then, if not enforced by the government, then on our own account? How long should we wear our masks for instance?
So one way to make it better globally is to immunize globally, because we are a global community now. It is impossible to say we are an island on our own, we don't worry about the rest of the world. When you immunize globally, what will happen is case numbers will go down. And when case numbers go down, unfortunately with SARS-CoV-2, it looks highly unlikely that we will ever eliminate it and it will become endemic. When it becomes endemic and it's low levels, at that stage, you can start to remove your restrictions. But at the same time, we need to be careful with elderly people, very vulnerable people who unfortunately remain vulnerable for a very long time. And for those sort of people, we should have preventative measures in place up front. And those preventative measures in place up front would be how to diagnose the infection very quickly, very soon in their infection, and then give to them antiviral drugs like Paxlovid as soon as possible. That will be the way forward in keeping elderly, vulnerable people safe when we go from the pandemic to the endemic stage.
And well, whether it's realistic or not, Europe and the US, there are discussions about the post-pandemic era, but at the same time, it's still a full-on pandemic for lower-income countries, which weren't able to access vaccines as easily. How much more severe is the impact of the pandemic in developing countries than it was for advanced economies?
The saving grace for the poorer economies is that the poorer economies also happen to have a younger population. And we do know that SARS-CoV-2 is less severe disease causing in the younger population. So if you take Africa, very young population, unimmunized, but they have fewer deaths. They have fewer deaths because Africa, they spend more time outdoors. And second thing, they have a younger population. Nevertheless, it has devastated their economies just as much as it has devastated Western, richer countries' economies.
And well, what kind of support and assistance do developing countries need right now?
Well, the good news is that we've got vaccines. And not only vaccines, but we've got enough vaccines for boosters in richer nations and vaccines to immunize countries that have not been immunized at all. So we've got the vaccines. But what is needed are the logistics, the needle, the syringe, the refrigeration, the IT, the logistics, the setting up of the clinics, the healthcare workers to give the vaccine, the communication, the advice to people that vaccines save your life and prevent you from severe illness. All that piece of work is needed so that as soon as possible, as fast as possible, we can immunize the continent of Africa and other parts of the world. Vaccines are available. We need the other armamentums to enable this to happen now.
And until now, vaccines have been targeting certain variants, but Dr. Anthony Fauci in the US wrote recently about the need for universal coronavirus vaccines. Now, how would these work and how plausible are they?
Oh, it is eminently plausible, and I'm sure research is going on right now as we speak. So how do I describe it for your listeners and viewers is as follows. The vaccines that we developed were against the spike protein. On the other hand, we could develop vaccines against other proteins on the virus. And if these other proteins do not keep on changing shape as often as the spike proteins do, then we have a successful universal vaccine which will carry on working even if the spike protein keeps on changing its shape. It is attacking a completely different protein in a different part of the virus, and therefore it works.
Well, in the future, if there is another major coronavirus outbreak, what do you hope to see done differently? Do you think future outbreaks could be isolated or prevented from turning into pandemics?
It's very difficult to do so if we have a highly virulent virus. But what we need to do is learn from our mistakes. And the biggest story is no one is well until everyone is well. The Western countries, the richer nations must learn that unless and until you immunize the whole world simultaneously, it's not going to work. What happened with America, European Union, United Kingdom was they selfishly immunized their population only. And then they've had to keep on giving them boosters and such interventions. Whereas if they had followed the World Health Organization pandemic outbreak control plan, they would have immunized everyone all over the world simultaneously, starting with vulnerable people and healthcare workers and essential workers, and work their way down. But what we're doing is bring it down gently across the globe. But of course, politics dictates that you immunize your own population and you don't worry about elsewhere, and that's a mistake.
And nowadays, of course, there are a lot of concerns about long COVID and the ramifications of that. And what are the symptoms that are common and that we should be on alert for?
Yes, well, long COVID is a really big worry. And I have been saying since the pandemic arose that the best thing anyone can do is don't get infected, don't infect others, and don't drop your guard. Because with long COVID, what it is a autoimmune reaction set into your own body after the infection has come and gone. And it affects the brain, affects the heart, and other organs. And only yesterday, a report was published in Nature journal, which said that people who have sudden loss of smell and taste have reduced cortical activity, meaning reduced brain size, reduced functionality of their brains. Therefore, in some people, long COVID is very real and very important, and we haven't got a cure for it. So the best advice I can give to anyone, anywhere is don't drop your guard, don't get infected, don't infect others, get your vaccines.
And finally, well, most of the attention has been on vaccines during this pandemic, but what about therapeutics? Have we seen major advances there?
Yes, we have, and it is really good of you to ask that question, because it is really pleasing that in a short time, less than 2 years, we invented a successful platform of vaccines. And then we also found that in people who needed oxygen support, early intervention with steroids was helpful, and it stopped people from dying. And now we've also got several platforms of antiviral drugs. And this together is making a big difference. The antiviral drugs, the immunoglobulins, the steroids, and other drugs, as well as the vaccines, as well as better techniques for ventilating patients. All of this is reducing deaths. All of this is making it better, and soon we will go from the pandemic to the endemic stage.
Well, Dr. Pankenya, thank you so much for staying up for us. Your home is looking as lovely as ever. Well, that was Professor Bharat Pankenya, Senior Clinical Lecturer at the University of Exeter's College of Medicine and Health. Thank you again so much for your insights.
Thank you.
And now for a look at news from around the world, we connect with Lee Seung-jae joining us from our Arirang newsroom. Good morning, SJ.
Good morning to you guys.
Yes, good morning, Seung-jae. So while the world celebrated International Women's Day on Tuesday, unfortunately we had violence in a number of different countries where women use the occasion of International Women's Day to protest.
That's right. So they say on International Women's Day, you give bread and roses. Unfortunately, for many women around the world, they were instead met with violence. Now, let's say, for instance, over in Turkey, riot police clashed with protesters who gathered in Istanbul to celebrate the days, as the police used a pepper spray to disperse a crowd of several thousand in the city center. Now, Istanbul's governor's office said Monday that it would not allow marches, protesters, or press statements to mark the event in the area. However, women still gathered despite the heavy police presence, leading to scuffles and riot police using their shields to push them back. Meanwhile, over in Sudan, protesters used International Women's Day to rally against military rule, and they were also met with tear gas as they approached the presidential palace. Women's rights groups had called for the protests along with other organizations, as they have been holding rallies since the military took power in October. Now, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said Tuesday that it has successfully put a second military satellite into orbit. The Noor-2 was placed into orbit 500 kilometers above Earth and follows their first military satellite, which was launched in April 2020. The Noor-1 was placed in orbit 425 kilometers above the Earth's surface, and the announcement comes after talks were held in Vienna to revive an agreement restraining Iran's nuclear program. Now, experts say putting a second satellite in space would be a major advance for Iran's military, raising concerns about the country's nuclear and missile programs. Now, flood warnings continued across Australia's east coast on Tuesday, while tens of thousands of Sydney residents fled their homes overnight as torrential rains slammed the region once again. The country's eastern rivers were close to overflowing following record downpours over the recent weeks, which cut off towns and swept away farms, livestock, and roads. Meanwhile, the death toll from the week-long floods rose to 20 after the bodies of a man and a woman were discovered in the floodwaters. The National Weather Bureau warned of a tough 48 hours ahead for Sydney, with 60,000 people subject to evacuation orders. Batgirl and Flash. Now, they were among the thousands of superheroes seen at the 10th edition of the Middle East Film and Comic Convention in Abu Dhabi. Now, it is known as the biggest pop culture show in the region, bringing together nearly 22,000 people for the three-day event. Now, among the celebrity guests attending the event were Charles Martinet, the voice of Mario in the Super Mario video game series, as well as actress Ming-Na, who voiced Mulan from the animated Disney movie. But most importantly, for comic fans, it was a great chance to dress up as their favorite characters.
Good morning. If you're heading to your local polling station early in the day, dress accordingly. It's a chilly start, but the highs will rise fast to the mid-teens in the capital and of course even higher in the southern provinces, leading to wide gaps in the readings between lows and highs. However, the comfortable temperatures come with high levels of ultra-fine dust. Central regions, 전라북도, 경상북도, and even on Jeju Island will have a dusty day with dry weather warning remaining in place for eastern parts of the country. Thick fog will cover the west through the morning, and daily lows are 1 to 4 degrees Celsius higher than the same time yesterday. Seoul beginning the day at about 2 degrees Celsius and sunny skies to start across much of Korea. It's going to feel more like early April than early March this afternoon. Daegu and Gwangju will be quite warm, topping out at 19 degrees Celsius this afternoon. Unfortunately, the dust will stay through Sunday when we have some much-needed nationwide rain in the forecast. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that's all we have for now. We'll be back at 8 a.m. Korea time on Thursday for our next edition of New Day at Arirang. We appreciate you tuning in. I'm Kim Mo-kyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Until next time, goodbye.
Everyone knows I'm passionate. Know why? Look at how passionate Koreans are. And you know I'm fast. Don't blink. Korean move fast too. I'm creative on the pitch. People say I'm smart. Just look how smart Korea is. I aim to be spectacular for the fans. Why am I so fun? Is it because Korea is so much fun? Visit Korea and find out for yourself. See you there. This is my Korea. What's yours?